The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Seeker After Truth by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Alternative View. A certain Sufi agreed to take an ordinary man on a journey to see life and death from another point of view. They came to a tomb of a holy man, around which people were walking and saying prayers. The ordinary man said, "See how the memory of that man is blessed by these multitudes who circumambulate his resting place day and night." The reality, said the Sufi, is that the saint is revered because he spent all his time with people, so that they did nothing in this world, and he allowed them to crowd around him and ask him questions until he died of fatigue, cutting off his possible usefulness in other ways and places in the world. Next they came to the palace of a man who was waited on hand and foot by people who sang his praises night and day. "Let us shun this man," said the ordinary man, "for since he allows people to behave in this disgusting manner, there must be something unpleasant about him." The reality, said the Sufi, is that it is because the like of you shun him, he is at the mercy of fawning idiots. It would be far better to discover for yourself whether he really enjoys this adulation, and if he does not, to help him by showing those people that they are behaving in the wrong way. Then they came to a place where a man was talking to a crowd, and they were listening most attentively. "What a disciplined and worthy collection of people," said the ordinary man. "We should surely gain something by associating with them." "The reality is," said the Sufi, "that these people have formed such a habit of listening that they cannot think or act. It would be better if we were to help them think and act as well as listen, not just become listeners ourselves." The ordinary man said to the Sufi, "But if one cannot judge by the outward and by one's own inward feelings, what is one to do in the absence of a man of insight who will tell one what to do?" "I did not say that one cannot judge by the outward at all," said the Sufi. "But I do say that to imagine that everything which looks the same is no basis for learning. The outward may be reliable, and it may not be. The teacher can help you to attain understanding which interprets the outward as well as perceiving the inward. While you seek information through outwardness alone, you will not be seeking understanding. If you want cherries, why do you look for diamonds?" Disguise. A student travelled to a far country. One day he was invited to the house of a rich man, and he was amazed and disturbed to find, among the pampered guests, his own Sufi teacher, dressed like the leader of a cult. He said, as soon as he could speak to him privately, "Honoured sir, what has become of you? This matted hair, these bells and recitations, this grotesque robe. It is you who taught us to shun such things like the plague." "Hush," said the Sufi, "for it is not what has become of me, but what has befallen these people among whom I am working. Do you not see that if they thought I was not a fraud, they would never even admit me to their company? I realize that they would let me come here if they could laugh at me. Now it is for me to use this advantage to help them understand." Follower. A man went to a Sufi and said, "I wish to become your follower." The Sufi asked, "Would you become the follower of a dog?" "No," said the man, Then you cannot follow our path, for I myself am the follower of a dog, and you should account my master as being greater than me." "How," asked the would-be follower, "can you be the follower of a dog?" "Because I once saw a dog deal kindly with another one which had surrendered to it." The visitor said, "But you have a regular system of discipleship, a study center, people coming and going and treating you with the greatest respect. You have reached a higher stage than looking at how dogs behave." "You are describing what you want," said the master. "You want to enter a teaching with regular rituals, with people showing respect, with a visible study center. You do not seek to be a Sufi. You seek to belong to such a community. They are not the same thing." "But if I have been attracted by your outward shape, it is your fault, surely, for allowing it to be presented to the world in this way," said the other man. "What the world makes of it is one thing. What the disciple understands by it is another," said the Sufi. "If you are seeking ritual, community, music, labor, service, as you understand these things, you will be most in need of those who can teach you through other methods. To pander to your outward requirements is not Sufism, though everyone in the world may think so." The ignorant. A certain Sufi was asked, "Why do you tolerate ill-advised questions?" He smiled and said, "In order to gain for us all the advantages of observing such queries as you have just made." Another who was present recited, "Without the night, who would know of the day? Bitter peaches are spurned, yet it is those which help in the acceptance of the sweet. The child endears himself to us by mistakes, and gives a clue to what we should do, just as much as we may admire a prodigy." 1001 Days. A would-be disciple visited the home of a Sufi teacher. He was told, "You must try to answer a question. If you succeed, he will accept you for teaching in 3 years' time." The question was put, and the seeker puzzled over it until he had the answer. The teacher's representative took his answer to the master and returned with the message, "Your answer is correct. You may now go away for the 1001 days waiting, after which you will be allowed to return here to receive the teaching." The applicant was delighted. When he had thanked the other man, he asked, "What would have happened if I had failed to provide the correct answer?" "Oh, in that case, you would have been admitted immediately." Classical encounter. The kind of classical encounters familiar to readers from the great Sufi literature of the past still continue all over the world. Their value both for the participants, for observers, and for those who read or hear about them also goes on in the same way. I was once talking to a noted theologian of Baghdad and touched on dervishes and their ways. Without troubling to inquire whether I wanted a harangue or not, he launched into a tremendous diatribe. They were frauds, impostors, and self-deluded. They wanted people to follow them and to get a fat living for posing and doing nothing else. Their mysteries and so-called psychological processes were nonsense and opposed to Islam in any case. The only good work connected with this repulsive cult was among those few clever and self-sacrificing Muslims who pretended to be Sufis and then steered people attracted to them back into the salvation of Islam. Not only were the Sufis horrors, but he would take me this very instant to somewhere where these foul heathens were even now assembled, and prove their noisomeness to me without any fear of contradiction, as a service to truth. I followed him through the streets to a house where, on his knock, The door opened, and a young man led us into the courtyard beyond it, into the presence of a number of unhorrifying-looking people who were sitting, in the evening cool, around the rim of a quiet pool of water. They rose politely when the raging divine approached them, and motioned him to repose himself with murmurs of welcome. My companion was not very impressed. He started to shout, "Away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed," in a very loud voice, startling a collection of white pigeons who rose into the air and wheeled about. "Away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed." It started to sound like a litany as he repeated the formula again and again, now jumping up and thrusting his face first, then his extended forefinger into the faces of the dervishes. They said nothing at first. Then I became aware that they, too, were repeating the chant, "Away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed." This development so infuriated the alleged man of God that he gave a wild cry, smote the heel of his hand on his forehead, and, leaving me sitting there, rushed from the courtyard. I heard his shouting from the street beyond the garden wall, echoing away into the distance. The seated figures continued to repeat the words of their critic several more times until, becoming lower and lower, the sound died away. I asked their leader, seated on a sheepskin at the centre of the group, why they should take up the cry of a detractor. He said, "The man who came here is a well-known and highly respected theologian and doctor of the law. Many of the things which he says, though only quotations and not reflecting his own state, are valuable and adequate admonitions. We are all aware that it is necessary to make away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed, and we are of course grateful to those who remind us of it, so that we too may concentrate upon this necessity for a space of time. So we adopted this man's very good advice to dwell upon the theme which he brought us. No doubt it will do us good." "But," I said, "since he thinks that you are the hypocrites and miscreants who have to be opposed, and since he would not imagine that you are adopting the lesson, and since he must have regarded your echoing him as a taunt, what good has all this done him?" One of the other Sufis raised his head. "If he was trying to do good, he would not have sought any advantage from it. Real good is only that which is done without expectation of reward or fear of punishment if neglected. But if you have really not observed what advantage this theologian obtained, I will tell you. He gained the satisfaction of imaginedly convincing us that we were evil and insusceptible to truth. This, in his own mind, made him for the moment feel that he was in some way good. And since he is ordinarily in great doubt about this, he has to seek out evidence for it, and to provoke incidents which will support his flagging faith." The doorways. Told by Nurjan Ali Bey. I was carrying a bundle of door frames down the steps of a college between the second and third floors. A well-dressed man sitting in one of the rooms opening off the stairway called out to me, and I went into the room to see what he wanted. "Get those things out of here at once," he said. I told him that that was exactly what I was doing. "But," I said, "I think they are of importance. See how well made they are, and how they fit one into the other for carrying, and how light they are. There must be a dozen here." I was admiring them because they had been made by the great teacher Mazumi. I knew his work, had found them in the college, realized that they were not allowed there, and was taking them to a safe place. I intended to inform him that I had them to save him from being criticized, because I knew that he was absent-minded. The other man said, "How can you talk with honeyed words about trivialities, negligible man?" I said, "These doorway frames were made by Ustad Mazumi." With hardly a pause, he answered, "Mazumi's work is both symbolic and functional. That he should leave so much of it here is a blessing upon us. I knew that he was here the other week, but I thought that he was visiting a colleague of ours. But to think that he was working, and those frames will certainly fit our doors. What wonderful fairy wood! You had better take them back to the floors above and leave them there. We can certainly make an exception in the case of Hadrat Mazumi. When I next saw Mazumi, I said, "Your immortality is guaranteed on earth. They value your doors above their souls." Mazumi said, "Nurjan, know that it was your late father, mercy upon him, who placed his cloak upon my shoulders, to make me accepted as his successor in the teaching. When he did so, he said, 'Give this robe to my son Nurjan when he is to succeed you. This day will be when people will think that your door frames are better than his company.'" I later discovered that the frames were not even ones made by Mazumi. But from that day, with Mazumi's recommendation, I became a respected teacher. Wishing to be wise. People often mistake dervishes who are treading the Sufi path for Sufis who have already trodden it. There is a tale told by a dervish which helps to fix this distinction in the mind. There was once a young man, he related, who sought out a dervish and asked him, "I wish to be wise. How can I achieve my wish?" The dervish heaved a great sigh and answered, "There was once a young man just like you. He wished to be wise, and this wish had great strength. Suddenly he found himself sitting, as I am, with a youth, like you, seated before him, asking, 'How can I be wise?'" Bound hand and foot. A disciple asked a Sufi master, "It is said that the world is deceit, and yet again that things of the world help to another world. How can deceit help towards goodness?" The Sufi drew a deep and cold breath and answered, "Harmless striped flies remind you of the sting of the wasp and help the fly. Is this deceit? When the predator sees the spots on the butterfly's wing, he imagines that it is the eyes of a tiger looking at him, and he flees. Is this deceit? Sometimes, indeed, there is no other way to treat with men than to appear to be something which will make them act in a certain way, for their own benefit." "If I could only have an illustration of that," said the disciple. "And so you shall," answered the Sufi. "Have you not heard the true story of a great sage of former years?" The King and the Doctor. He was a doctor, and the king of a certain country called him to treat his ailment. The sage refused. Then the king ordered soldiers to seize the doctor and to bring him to his presence. When they were face to face, the king said, "I have brought you here, bound hand and foot, to treat me, for I am suffering from an unaccountable paralysis. If you cure me, I shall reward you. If you do not, I shall have you beheaded." The doctor said, "Let us be placed together in a room from which all other persons have been excluded." When they were alone, the sage brought out a knife and said, "Now I shall take revenge for the insult of your having treated me with such violence." And he advanced upon the king. Terrified out of his wits, the king leapt up and ran around the room, forgetting his paralysis in his anxiety to escape from the Sufi. As he cried for the guards, the Sufi ran to a window and fled. The king was cured by the only method which could have availed. But he nurtured a grievance against the Sufi for many years. Such is the peculiarity of men who think that deceit is always evil. Value of parables. Question: what is the value of parables in learning how to learn? Answer: this one should tell you, by means of itself, what use they are. My father's son. There was once a Sufi who was approached by a prospective disciple. The Sufi said to him, "If I say my father's son is not my brother, whom do I mean?" The disciple could not work it out. The Sufi told him, "I mean me, of course. Now you just go back to your village and forget about your desires to be a disciple." The man returned home, and the people asked him what he had learnt. He said, "If I say my father's son is not my brother, whom do I mean?" The other villagers chorused, "You!" "You're wrong," he replied. "My father's son is the Sufi in the next town. He told me so." Heeding and unheeding. Two disciples were once talking in a Sufi school. One said, "I shall die if our master persists in ignoring me, as he has done for the past 10 years, for I came here to learn, and I feel that I am being prevented." The other was equally emphatic. "I, on the other hand," he said, "shall undoubtedly die unless the master continues to harangue me, for every time he does so I realize my ignorance more deeply, and am thus that much further towards wisdom." The remaining members of the community eagerly discussed which of them was right, until the master appeared for the weekly meal. Now one of the community seated himself between the two, and held up his hand to signify that he had a request to make. "Continue," said the master. "I wish to ask that you continue to ignore this man on my left until he dies, and begin to ignore this other one on my right for the same reason, so that the rest of us may become perceptive of your desires. In this way I hope that we shall learn, as well as being delivered from the tiresomeness of amateur dramatics." Disputation. It is related that two students of the Sufi way were arguing about man. The first said, "Man arrives at truth by personal effort and research. Beginning with ignorance, he graduates to knowledge." The second said, "Man arrives at truth only through guidance by expert masters." They almost came to blows, and were far from resolving their contentions when a real Sufi happened to pass. The two decided to refer the question to him. "Pronounce on this issue?" he asked. "Yes, please," they urged him. "Very well. Now, has each of you seen dogs disputing about a bone?" "We have," they said. "And have you ever seen the bone itself join in the argument? Think about it." This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.